When we think of medieval justice, our minds often conjure images from Hollywood, shadowy dungeons filled with elaborate torture devices, sadistic executioners reveling in cruelty, and screaming victims subjected to unimaginable horrors. But the reality of medieval law enforcement was far more mundane, more bureaucratic, and in many ways, more disturbing than the sensationalized version we've inherited. The true face of medieval punishment wasn't hidden in castle dungeons. It was displayed in every town square across Europe, where justice served not just to punish the guilty, but to reinforce social order through public spectacle and communal participation. Medieval legal systems operated on fundamentally different principles than our modern courts. The concept of rehabilitation didn't exist. Instead, punishment served three primary functions: extracting what authorities believed to be truth, enforcing rigid social hierarchies, and creating public deterrence through visible consequences. The accused had few rights we would recognize today. Confessions were considered the gold standard of evidence, and the legal framework was explicitly designed to obtain them, whether through intimidation, discomfort, or outright pain. Perhaps no punishment better illustrates the public nature of medieval justice than the stocks and pillory. These wooden restraint devices were fixtures in virtually every town square, market, and village green across Europe. The stock secured a person's ankles while seated, forcing an awkward, uncomfortable position. The pillory was more severe. It locked the head and hands through holes in a wooden board, leaving the person standing and completely vulnerable. These weren't instruments of torture in the sensationalized sense. No one was maimed or killed by the stocks. Instead, they were instruments of profound social punishment. Minor offenders, drunkards, petty thieves, bakers who sold underweight loaves, brewers who watered down their ale would spend hours or days locked in these devices. The real punishment wasn't the physical discomfort of the restraint, though that was considerable. It was the public humiliation. Passers-by were encouraged, sometimes required, to mock and jeer. Rotten vegetables, mud, even human waste might be thrown. Your neighbors, the people you conducted business with, attended church with, lived beside, they all witnessed your shame. In tight-knit medieval communities where reputation was everything, this social death could be more devastating than physical punishment. A merchant pilloried for fraud might never regain customers. A woman in the stocks for suspected adultery faced permanent ostracism. The gendered nature of medieval punishment becomes even clearer when examining the scold's bridle, also known as the brank or gossip's bridle. This iron cage fitted over a woman's head, featuring a protruding bit that pressed down on the tongue, making speech painful or impossible. The scold's bridle wasn't used for serious crimes. It was deployed against women accused of nagging, gossiping, scolding their husbands, or simply speaking too freely in public spaces. The device's very existence reveals how medieval society viewed female speech as something requiring physical control. Women subjected to the brank would be paraded through town, the device locked in place, often led by a chain held by local authorities or even their own husbands. The message was unmistakable. A woman's voice, when raised in ways that challenged male authority or disrupted social harmony, would be literally silenced. The psychological trauma of this public ritual, the humiliation of being led like an animal, the inability to speak or defend oneself, the complicity of one's own community functioned as social control far more effectively than any fine or imprisonment. The scold's bridle existed not because medieval people were uniquely cruel, but because they understood that shame, when weaponized through public display, could enforce conformity more efficiently than violence. These public punishments reflected a broader evolution in medieval legal thinking. Earlier medieval periods relied heavily on trial by ordeal, dunking accused persons in water, making them carry hot iron, or forcing them to pluck stones from boiling water. These ordeals operated on the principle that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. But by the 13th century, the Church began withdrawing support for ordeals, declaring them sacrilegious. This created a legal crisis. How could truth be determined? The answer was a shift toward judicial torture and sworn confession, which necessitated the development of systematic methods to extract those confessions. The devices we associate with medieval torture weren't relics of primitive barbarism, they were products of legal modernization, tools created when human judgment replaced divine intervention in the courtroom. As we move from public shaming to the devices that dominate our popular imagination, we enter a landscape where historical fact and sensationalist fiction have become nearly impossible to separate. The torture chamber of legend, filled with exotic and elaborate instruments of agony, owes more to 19th century showmanship than medieval reality. The rack represents perhaps the most historically documented of the famous torture devices. It was exactly what it sounds like, a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The prisoner's wrists and ankles would be tied to ropes attached to these rollers, which could be turned to stretch the body. The rack was undeniably used in medieval and early modern interrogations, particularly in England's Tower of London and in various continental European jurisdictions during the religious upheavals of the 16th and 17th centuries. But here's what popular culture gets wrong. The rack was a go-to tool of routine justice. Its use was heavily regulated, typically requiring authorization from high-ranking officials, kings, judges, or church authorities. Why? Because even medieval legal theorists recognized a fundamental problem with torture. Confessions obtained under extreme duress were unreliable. A person subjected to the rack would confess to anything true or false simply to make the pain stop. Smart interrogators understood this limitation. The rack was generally reserved for cases involving treason, heresy, or plots against the state, situations where authorities believed they already knew the truth and simply needed the formality of confession, or where they sought to extract names of co-conspirators. Moreover, the rack's actual use was often more psychological than physical. The mere threat of the rack, showing the device to a prisoner and describing its function, frequently produced confessions without a single crank being turned. When it was employed, there were usually medical practitioners present to ensure the prisoner didn't die or become permanently incapacitated before trial, not out of mercy, but because a corpse couldn't provide testimony or face public execution. Now let's address the most iconic torture device of all, the Iron Maiden. This upright sarcophagus-shaped cabinet, lined with metal spikes on the interior, supposedly closed slowly on its victim, the spikes piercing the body at carefully calculated points to maximize pain while avoiding immediately fatal wounds. It's terrifying, it's memorable, and it's almost certainly a hoax. The most famous Iron Maiden, the one that inspired countless replicas and appeared in museums worldwide, is the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. But here's the problem. There's no credible evidence this device existed before the 18th or 19th century. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden appears to have been constructed around 1793, possibly assembled from pieces of various medieval artifacts, specifically for display in a collection of curiosities. It was sensationalist entertainment, not a genuine instrument of medieval justice. Extensive research into medieval legal records, trial transcripts, and execution accounts reveals no contemporary references to anything resembling the Iron Maiden. No medieval chronicler described it. No legal document authorized its use. No victim's testimony mentioned it. The spike-lined torture cabinet appears to be a complete fabrication, likely inspired by Renaissance-era engravings and later embellished by Gothic horror literature and entrepreneurial museum curators who understood that shocking exhibits drew paying crowds. Similarly problematic is the Judas cradle, also known as the Judas chair. This device allegedly featured a pyramid-shaped seat atop a tall stool. The victim would be suspended above it by ropes and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's point, which would be positioned to penetrate the body through the most sensitive areas. Weights might be added to increase pressure, and the process could continue for hours or days. While descriptions of the Judas cradle appear in some later texts, solid medieval documentation is remarkably scarce. Most references come from Renaissance-era accounts or even later sources, written during periods when demonizing the medieval past served political or religious purposes. The Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation both produced propaganda that exaggerated the cruelties of their opponents and the barbarism of earlier eras to demonstrate how enlightened their own age had become. The Judas cradle, like many exotic torture devices, may be more myth than reality, or at minimum, far less commonly used than popular culture suggests. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. The medieval torture chamber, as we imagine it, is largely a 19th century invention. The elaborate collections of torture devices displayed in castles and museums across Europe were often assembled centuries after the medieval period ended, curated to satisfy public fascination with the supposedly barbaric past. Entrepreneurs and early museum directors understood that torture sold tickets. They commissioned reproductions, sometimes invented entirely new devices, and presented them as authentic medieval artifacts. The real brutality of medieval and early modern justice wasn't found in elaborate contraptions. It was in the common, everyday punishments that left clear marks of authority on the body. Public whipping that stripped flesh from bone, branding with hot irons that marked criminals for life, and simple hanging or beheading, efficient, inexpensive, and undeniably effective methods of permanent punishment. These weren't exotic or complicated. They were bureaucratic, recorded in ledgers, and witnessed by entire communities as routine elements of social order. Understanding this distinction matters because it reveals how historical narratives are shaped not just by what actually happened, but by later generations' needs to construct morality tales about how far we've progressed. The myth of the torture chamber serves a comforting purpose. It lets us believe that past societies were uniquely cruel, fundamentally different from our own enlightened age. But the mundane reality that ordinary people participated in public shaming, that communities gathered to watch executions, that legal systems prioritized order and confession over truth and justice, that's the more disturbing lesson. It suggests that the capacity for systemic cruelty doesn't require sadistic innovation. It just requires normal people following institutional procedures.